When I was living just outside of Charlotte, North Carolina, in a town called Mooresville, I was a member of a Methodist church there, and our pastor, Terry, was one of the best pastors I've ever seen, knowing how to do the role holistically, because he knew that in order to get people to be truly motivated, that it wasn't just about being at church, it was the other hours that you were outside of church that mattered even more. And one of the things that he was constantly doing was research on the population that was around the town. And he would constantly, in small settings, give us statistics that between 93 and 94% of the people in the town didn't go to church. And it's interesting because you shared with me before the show that Barna's research shows that a significant percentage of pastors are considering changing vocations. I think the same thing probably goes with priest, and church attendance is declining. And I wanted to ask this question through this lens. One of my favorite books is The Power of Myth by Joseph Campbell. And I'm not sure if you've read it or not, but this was written at this point about 40 years ago, maybe 45 years ago. But in it, he had a pretty profound thinking. I have always thought that if you look at religions and what has happened over time, they have been updated. And he said, we've gone through one of the greatest periods where although we have new religions like Scientology and Latter day Saints and some of these, the major religions haven't been updated in thousands of years. And he said when that ends up happening, people don't know how to relate to it as well. And so they start drifting away from it until these become updated and more people can relate to the messages and learn how to apply them in their lives. Do you see any truth to what he was saying about that? And do you think that's one of the causes for so many people drifting away?
Such a great question, John. Deep question. I appreciate you're very thoughtful in all these topics. And I think when it comes to faith, the first thing you mentioned is that trap of compartmentalizing and making about one day, one building, 1 hour. And when you do that, what happens a lot of times is a double life. You're one way at church, and then you're a different person when you work or at home. And instead, the Bible talks about abiding. It's that humble walk with God where you work, learn, and play. It's a 24/7 relationship. It's not just religion and rituals. And the relationship side is so key. And so that's an important piece that you mentioned. I love how your pastor was so aware of that and was empowering people, equipping people, how to live that out. And then when it comes to Joseph Campbell, what's interesting is how you combine both the ancient and the new. And I see both in the text. There's the ancient. In my faith, following Jesus, Jesus is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And we're reading a book that was written 2,000 years ago. And the truth is timeless in one sense. It continues to be relevant today. And yet in that same book, there are statements like new wine. Well, what's new wine? New wine doesn't fit into old wineskins and old systems. They would burst. New wine. Wine represents joy. There's new songs. God says, I'm doing a new thing. And the Bible talks about understanding the times that we're living in. And ultimately, heaven is our home. So all things will be new as you look at the end of the Bible, and all things are being made new, new heaven and earth, new home. We're going to see God. That'll be new face to face. There's always the new that's coming. I think sometimes we get stuck in a rut, and it's tied to some preferences. It's tied to traditions that might not need to continue anymore. They were wonderful 20 years ago, but we don't actually need them today. And you can get stuck in a rut in a lot of different areas of life. In business, you can stop growing and learning, and you can just settle into complacency, stuck in a rut there. Sometimes people get stuck in a rut because they're just going through the motions. Like they just show up, they do the same thing. Their hearts aren't engaged. They're stuck in a rut. Sometimes there might be an event that worked 20 years ago, but now you got to come up with something different today. In our setting in Seattle, and Seattle is the second highest de-churched in the nation, ninth highest unchurched. So like you shared, most people, they're not considering church. Well, some do come to church, but a lot of times the church needs to go where people are. And ultimately, the church is not the building, it's the people. We started drive-through prayer when the pandemic broke out. And now we've been having drive-through prayer for years. And what is drive-through prayer? We are simply along the road of the busiest street in our city. Thousands of cars are coming by. And if anyone wants prayer, they can pull into the parking lot and we'll pray with them. And what's interesting is that people come in who don't know God, but they're hurting and they want to share and they want prayer, or they're crying, or they're in the middle of a conflict. We had one man that was in a fight with his wife, pulled into the parking lot. He was going to go to the casino to burn off steam, kind of numb some pain. After the prayer, he went back to his wife and reconciled. We have so many different people, from homeless people walking in to people in the most expensive cars pulling in, parents and kids pull in as well. And the stories that happen, why? Because it's a place where people can be real. And it's a safe place to process life and faith. And there's a sense that we want to lift up our eyes to the hills. Where does our help come from? The maker of heaven and earth. Like, we need God. We need some supernatural help with what we're facing right now, personally in our land. And all that to say, there's a phrase of keeping in step with God. Like, don't run ahead and come up with all your own plans and these new things that you're going to realize later, right? Hindsight's 2020. That wasn't the best idea. But also, don't be caught too far back where you're not moving with some of the fresh work, the fresh wind. And instead, you're kind of stuck in traditions. What's sad sometimes is when people elevate certain traditions and they make almost a god out of their tradition, where it's like, no, there's no life in that anymore. None of us can live in the past. I think, let me share this story, might be helpful, but the two temptations are to live in the past success or to live in the past failure. And if you live in the past success, you're always going to talk about, oh, those were the glory days, but nothing good's happening today. Those were the glory days. We can't go back and live in the past. If it was negative, the dirge might continue. And instead of healing, you're going to be stuck and just continue, maybe even in guilt and shame. You don't need to be there. There was a temple, and Solomon built a temple. It was incredible. So much investment, so much bling in that temple. And then there was a Babylonian invasion. They wiped out the temple. Now, the Israelites were in exile and they returned to the land. And as they rebuilt the next temple, Zerubbabel was involved. This is a little over 500 years BC. And they rebuilt this temple. The second temple didn't have all of the gold. It didn't have all of the beautiful, intricate designs. And some people cried, some rejoiced. But in the second temple, God said, I'm going to show up there and the glory is going to be greater. Why do I say that? We're in a culture right now that loves the outward appearance. How do you look on social media? How are your clothes? There's so much we can do to our appearance. And ultimately, it's not about the outside look. It's about what's happening on the inside. And God does a new work. It was a new temple, a new season, and new stories. I think it's important that we don't get married to the past or try to live in the past, because the people that do are not happy. They get stuck and they're miserable. At the same time, hold on. What do we learn from the past? What's good? That'll always be true. Truth is always good. Love is always good. Love your neighbor is always good. Don't let go of the majors. Major on the majors. The majors stay pretty consistent. But how that's lived out, how that's played out, that changes. And that's an interesting dynamic of both the ancient and the new. And I'm glad you brought that up. Faith is about a relationship, but I'll say this, faith is not a blind faith. When I didn't believe, I got out the facts, historical evidence. Like, is the Bible reliable? Is Jesus who he says he was? Is he risen? Is he God? Like, I had to kick the tires. And what I found out is that you put all the evidence on the table, and then you make your decision based on that evidence. Kind of like a jury looks over all the evidence and makes the best decision they can make. We're never going to prove it 100%. I couldn't prove God exists 100%. But look at all the evidence. And as you do that, that wonder, that awe, then make that best decision you can make based on the historical evidence. And that was the engagement for me with my mind and my heart. And that was connected to my faith decisions.